So in the last several lectures, we've been looking at the combined effects of the disappearance of communism as a viable alternative, both in practice and in the imagination of mainstream political thinking, as a serious economic alternative to capitalism on the one hand, and then on the other, the effects of the declining power of organized labor vis-a-vis capital in many of, if not all, of the Western democracies. And the effects of that have been to enhance in one way or another the prestige of what was called neoliberalism at home and the Washington consensus abroad. And we've seen how this played out, particularly in the agendas of privatization, the increasing independence of private money in politics that we talked about last time, and the erosion of what had been the social democratic consensus in Western Europe and the Great Society in the United States. For the next 4 lectures, we're going to refocus attention back to the global order, and particularly the idea that gained currency in the first decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that there really was going to be a new global order marked by the spread of democracy at home and the spread of democracy within countries and the reshaping of global international institutions. And that's basically what's going to preoccupy us. The first 2 lectures are going to be focused on the spread of democracy, or the expectation that it was going to spread around the world, and then the next 2 are going to deal with international institutions, if there was going to be a new global geopolitical order. What form would people expect it to take? I've called the lecture today Democracy's Fourth Wave ? And I'm going to focus principally on South Africa as a remarkable transition, with some comparisons to the Middle East and Northern Ireland. But I should say something about this language of waves. So the idea of waves of democracy came into currency, at least in the academic literature, in a book by Samuel Huntington published in 1991 called The Third Wave. And it had dealt, and I'll talk a little bit more about the waves in detail shortly, but Huntington had argued that a third wave of democratization following the first 2, the first wave having been the older democracies that democratized very slowly over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the second wave being mostly the democracies that emerged in the era of decolonization of Africa and Asia after World War II. And Huntington posited that despite expectations, he, among others, had written an article I think it was in the late 70s, maybe in the early 80s, predicting that we wouldn't see much more democracy. By 1991, in the third wave, he said, well, we can really date this new wave of democratization to the Portuguese Revolution of 1974, which led to democratizations in the former Portuguese colonies and elsewhere. He had, by the time he wrote that book, he had also seen the democratizations across Eastern Europe, which had largely occurred in 1989. But the changes in the Soviet Union lay in the future, and so he didn't have anything to say about that. And indeed, he had very little to say about the South African transition that we're going to focus on today, which was also mostly in the future. And the other books that came out around that time, such as Adam Przeworski's Democracy and the Market, also were basically looking at this period in the last part of the 20th century, from 1974 through the redemocratization of Eastern Europe. And they thought, is this the third wave? Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and some of the developments we're going to be talking about over the next several lectures, there's been a lot of speculation about a fourth wave that would incorporate some of the cases like the South African transition, the Arab Spring, that was much heralded in 2011 and 2012. And we'll hold off assessing whether or not we think there's a fourth wave is underway or likely until we've gone through looking at the conditions for the creation and survival of democracy and how we should think about the various efforts, some successful, some not, at democratization in recent times. So the South African transition to democracy, which occurs in the late 1980s, it really starts and goes through the first election of 1994. The one thing to say about it was a highly improbable outcome. Nobody really expected it. Indeed, if you go back to the 1970s, which is when I started out in political science, it was a very common observation to say that some of the political conflicts in the world were just so difficult they were never going to be solved. They were basically sort of the political basket cases of the world. The conflicts were just too entrenched. The possibility of a successful outcome too elusive, and that we just have to sort of come to grips with the fact that there's some political conflicts that can't be solved. And the three exhibits that were always wheeled out to make this point were the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, the Israel-Palestine conflict, which had been going on in one form or another since 1948 at least, and South Africa, the struggle between the apartheid regime, which had come to power in 1948 but had replaced a previous government that had also been heavily racist. And many times people said, well, the South African conflict is the most intractable of intractables, partly because it was based on race and racial exclusion. It's very difficult to split the difference when you know, it's one of the terms we use in talking about identity politics is that identity politics tends to involve indivisible goods, not divisible goods. If you think back to our earlier discussion of the divided dollar game, that presumes that you're dealing with a divisible good, right? So you can divide it up in different ways, and you can therefore you can form different coalitions and so forth. When you're dealing with indivisible goods, those options are unavailable. So we had an indivisible good, namely race, and then we had a small white minority, less than 20% of the population, considerably less, and they were in power and they were in control of the most powerful military in Africa until the prospect of a transition became real. They were widely known to have nuclear weapons, which they eventually gave up, and it didn't seem like they would give up without a fight and go anywhere. And so most people, even people who thought the system was unstable, which many people did, thought that it would be much more likely to end in a civil war or a bloodbath. And of course, it was also wired into the Cold War because it was seen as staunchly anti-communist and so supported by many Western governments in the 1980s. And indeed, in the US, there was a huge fight over sanctions against South Africa during the Reagan administration when the Democrats controlled Congress, as you now know. And eventually, the sanctions were passed over Ronald Reagan's veto in the mid-1980s, which is a difficult thing to do. You need 2/3 in both houses. So you can see by the 1980s, the support for the South African regime was certainly hemorrhaging in the advanced democracies, but nonetheless, they were wired into the Cold War until the end of it, and so didn't come under great pressure from Western governments, certainly not the US government. So when I left South Africa in 1972, I didn't believe I would ever go back. I thought that the possibilities for a young white person I was 15 years old, the possibilities for making a life there were virtually non-existent. By that time, once you had turned 16, they would not give you a passport if you hadn't been to the military. And by that time, military service increasingly was not sitting around in the desert being ordered about by a lance corporal, but doing crowd control in places like Soweto. And I decided it was not for me, and I really did, my beliefs were not unusual. The vast majority of people in the 1970s would have said this conflict is going to get worse before it gets even worse. And the outcome is not, certainly a good outcome was not in view. And so the world was shocked on the 2nd of February in 1990 when Americans turned on the evening news, and this is what they heard.
Sitting in tonight, Diane Sawyer.
Good evening. They were bold words, words that millions of people had waited years to hear. Today, in a 45-minute State of the Nation speech, President F.W. de Klerk transformed 30 years of South African politics. He declared the African National Congress, the major black opposition group in South Africa, to be legal. He promised that its most famous leader, Nelson Mandela, would soon be free. Our first report is from ABC's Richard Sergey in Cape Town.
Nearly 5,000 people who gathered near Parliament to protest against apartheid today wound up celebrating.
It's like a dream come true, that's true.
It's a big step forward, a big step forward.
Opening his first parliamentary session as president, de Klerk made one thing clear right away. The government is ready to begin negotiating South Africa's future with the black majority.
The season of violence is over. The time for reconstruction and reconciliation has arrived.
De Klerk told his colleagues he was implementing a series of immediate reforms, partially lifting the state of emergency, suspending executions, and easing restrictions on internal opposition groups. Then came the biggest change in policy.
The prohibition of the African National Congress is being rescinded.
For the first time in 30 years, the white government's sworn enemy, the ANC, will be allowed to operate openly in South Africa. It wasn't until the end of his speech that de Klerk finally mentioned the name everyone was waiting to hear, Nelson Mandela.
The government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally. I am serious about bringing this matter to finality without delay.
But de Klerk says Mandela won't be released until what the president called his personal circumstances and safety are worked out. De Klerk has met nearly all the conditions that Mandela had set for leaving prison.
I believe that we have to give Mr. de Klerk very, very considerable credit, and we may be seeing history in the making.
But leaders of the African National Congress in exile were more cautious.
Quite clearly, an important step forward has been made, but perhaps it's half of a step.
Still, President de Klerk's speech confirmed the worst fears of white conservatives.
We will fight him with everything we have to retain the right of self-determination of the white people and to secure that there will be no domination of black people over whites.
Growing pressure here and abroad for real change left de Klerk with very little choice. Today he challenged critics on both sides. Walk through the open door, he said. Take your place at the negotiating table. Richard Sergey, ABC News, Cape Town.
So that was an astonishingly dramatic moment. It's hard to overstate, as I said, how much it surprised many people across the world. And not only that, everything that de Klerk said, he followed through on. Early in that year, they unbanned all illegal political organizations. They released all political prisoners, including Mandela, from prison, and legalized all political organizations, many of which had been banned. They then, over the course of the next 3 years, negotiated a settlement and voluntarily gave up power. And since that time, we've had elections in 94, 99, 2004, 2009, 2014, and 2019, which have been judged by independent organizations to be genuine elections, free and fair elections, not rigged elections. And it is true that the South Africa has not passed what political scientists sometimes refer to as the two-turnover test. The political scientists don't like to call a country a democracy until it's happened twice that a government has lost an election and actually given up power, because you don't know what they'll do if they lose an election. And we don't know what the ANC would do if it lost an election. So in that sense, it's not a consolidated or an established democracy, but there are some pretty reasonable signs in the sense that, first of all, we have had turnover in the leadership. We haven't had a sort of situation as with Mugabe in Zimbabwe, where he staggered on for decades until he was finally dragged out of there. Instead, we've had hard-fought, but nonetheless successful transitions. After Mandela stepped down after one term. Some people say his most important, the most important decision of his premiership, because it was a norm setting that people don't stay indefinitely, followed by our provost yesterday. Then we had transition to Mbeki, to Zuma, and then a very hard-fought transition to Cyril Ramaphosa more recently. But we have seen people giving up power in the leadership of the ANC. And then it's also the case that the ANC has become accustomed to losing elections and giving up some power, because in addition to Cape Town, which is controlled by the opposition Democratic Alliance for a long time, they have in more recent elections, they have lost control of the other major cities, Port Elizabeth, Pretoria, and Johannesburg, to opposition parties. And so local politics is not unimportant in South Africa. And so the notion that when you lose an election, you actually give up power, while it's not been embedded at the level of the national government, has some traction in the South African experience. There are many problems with corruption in South African politics, much of which will concern us, or the causes of it will concern us on next Tuesday. But by the standards of the evaluation of most democracies, South Africa looks pretty good. They have the other indicators you might be concerned about. They have a relatively free press, freedom of association, an operating legal system, and so on. And so certainly by the standards of many new democracies, it's been quite a remarkable story. So today's agenda is we're going to talk first a little bit about getting and keeping democracy, what's required to get democracy, what's required to keep it. This will involve revisiting some of the themes of modernization theory that I talked about earlier when we were talking about China. Then I'm going to talk about transitions to democracy, and I'm going to separate out 4 types of transition and say something about them. Then we're going to zero in on one of those 4 types, which are negotiated settlements of the sort that we witnessed in South Africa during the 1990s, and that will lead us to some evaluation of success, failure, and inconclusiveness by looking at that transition in contrast with the continuous failure after failure in the Israel-Palestine conflict and the more inconclusive results in Northern Ireland. Okay, So getting and keeping democracy. There's some historical context to this, some of which I have alluded to. Huntington coined the phrase 3 waves, and the first wave begins in the late 18th century, really, with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and it extends to the early 20th century with the enfranchisement of women in most countries, except Switzerland, when it didn't come for another half century, and the enfranchisement, the reducing the voting age, often from 21 to 18, which came in many countries during the 1960s. So it was a very gradual and long transition. And that's not really surprising if you think about it, because elites were afraid of democracy for reasons we've already talked about. They had some intuitive grasp of the logic behind the median voter theorem, although they didn't use that terminology, but they were worried. They were worried that if they suddenly enfranchised the whole population, it would threaten their position and their property. And so, for instance, in Britain, we got significant expansion of the franchise in 1832, more in 1867, more in 1885, women in the 1920s, and young people, 18-year-olds in the 1960s. So it was a sort of some baby steps before big steps. In the European countries, it happened a little more rapidly, a lot of enfranchisement in countries like Germany in 1870, but still we see a gradual process of evolution, if you like, toward democracy rather than universal franchise. And that is one thing that differentiates the first wave from the second wave, because the second wave is really bound up with anti-colonial struggles against Britain, particularly in Africa and Asia, but also against the other colonial powers. And those were countries that went from very restricted or no franchise to universal franchise more or less overnight. So it was a very different kind of set of transitions, and they had they happened much faster for that reason. And then the third wave, as I said to you already, is retrospectively dated by Huntington, somewhat arbitrarily, one might say, to the Portuguese Revolution in 1974, and what subsequently followed in Eastern Europe in particular in the late 1980s. Now, this creates, this talk about waves of democracy and getting more and more democracies, and indeed by the turn of the 21st century, we had more democracies in the world than more non-democracies for the first time in human history, even if it was the case that more people lived in non-democracies than in democracies, because some of the non-democracies have huge populations. But nonetheless, it creates a kind of air of teleology that informed the idea of the end of history that we've already talked about. This idea that the world is steadily becoming more democratic, and it just would be a matter of time before these waves would come along, and eventually the whole world would be democratic. That was never a very good bet. So if you think about the three waves, each one of those waves has had significant undertow. So if we think about the first wave, yes, we had the revolution in France in 1789. By 1791, it had turned into the Terror and something which nobody would think was recognizably a democracy. In Europe, in 1830, across the continent, we had democratic revolutions. Just about every country except the UK, which had led Marx and Engels to think this is the beginning and the end of capitalism. And even in the UK, we had the Chartist movement, which people were terrified might turn into a revolutionary movement, or hopeful that it might turn into a revolutionary movement, depending on your point of view. By 1832, those revolutions had collapsed and the monarchies had all been restored across the continent. The same thing happened in 1848. Again, democratic revolution swept Europe, and by 1849, 1850, they pretty much all collapsed, and the non-democracies were back. If we think about the 20th century, up through the end of the first wave, of course, we had the advent of fascism, of Nazism in Italy and in Germany, and in the US, massive retrenchment after the Civil War of democratic rights through the Jim Crow period, huge disenfranchisement. I talked about the Supreme Court's reading of the Civil War amendments last time to restrict their application, and particularly to restrict the application of the 15th Amendment, where you couldn't exclude people on the basis of race, but you could find surrogates like literacy tests and poll taxes and so forth. So there was lots of undertow to the first wave of democratization. It's not like you get these things and then you can't ratchet back. If you think about the second wave, again, many, many democracies that were established when the British left, the first election turned out to be the last election. Lots of theorizing and literature and speculation about why that is the case, or why that was the case. Perhaps one of the most plausible accounts is that where the British governed by direct rule, as in India, democracy got better traction because you had whole generations of Indian elites who went to Oxford and Cambridge and came back and embedded democratic norms and values in their institutions before the British left. Whereas in South Africa and much of the rest of Africa, the British governed indirectly, which essentially was much cheaper because you didn't have to set up your whole bureaucracy and civil service and institutional capacity, and instead found local chiefs, sometimes more or less created local chiefs, and said, provided you deliver what we want, you can govern as you please. And so there was much more indirect rule in Africa, unlike the direct rule in India. So some people put it down to that. Wonderful book on this subject by a man called Mahmoud Mamdani. I was a professor of political science and anthropology at Columbia, called Citizen and Subject, about the legacy of direct versus indirect rule. There are other theories, and it's not an unproblematic theory itself, because after all, Pakistan had the same direct rule as India and didn't have such a happy democratic future as India did. So it's a complex story, but nonetheless, there was plenty of undertow, many, many democracies that had been created as the imperial powers left turned out not to survive. And then if we think about the third wave, again, there's also been significant undertow there. We've seen, I probably should have put Pakistan on the second wave, but much of Latin America, we saw collapses of democracy in various countries, or at least serious compromising of it in Burma, in Fiji, where coups seem to come and go. Algeria in 1991, we had a coup, and of course, the ongoing questions about Russian democracy that have become more acute with time. So the idea that there's some inevitabilism, that, you know, democracies just, once you get it, you keep it forever, clearly not true. Democracies can fall apart, and sometimes they do. And so that puts on the table the question, so what are the conditions for democracy to arrive, and what are the conditions for democracy to survive? And that provokes some theoretical questions, and there's a huge theoretical literature in political science. I underlined the science because political science aspires to make predictions. It aspires to tell us what the conditions are under which we are likely to get a particular outcome. And so what can we predict? And on democratization, one distinction that political scientists have made that was not present in the early modernization literature that I was talking about when we discussed China, is a distinction between transitions to democracy and the survival of democracy. And in particular, Adam Pravorsky and his co-authors in this book, published at the turn of the century, said we should really think differently about these two things. And the reason is that what produces transitions to democracy is probably inherently unpredictable. It depends on so many contingencies that have to line up that you really can't predict when it's going to happen. On the other hand, you can say something about it, however you get a democracy, how likely is it to survive? And so Pravorsky and others said we should really separate out these two things and stop talking about transitions. And so his work and work of many other colleagues represent pretty much a conventional wisdom about survival. So if I just to do a little polling here before I tell you what they say, if I said to you, have we got the microphone? What do you think it's most important to have for a democracy to survive? Anyone?
An educated population.
An educated population is one possibility. Others?
A strong judicial system.
Strong judicial system.
Healthy economy.
Healthy economy. A couple more here.
I would say that all actors in the economy or in the political system believe they can win more from the system than from trying to overthrow it.
Okay, yep.
A middle class.
A middle class. Barrington Moore supporter over there, yep. Okay, so it is the economy stupid, as Clinton is famous for saying. People used to think political culture mattered a lot, or that certain kinds of religions were more or less compatible with democracy. But if you look at the data, none of those things is much of a predictor. And so here are the main things that people say are important for a democracy to survive. One is per capita income of about $14,019 2019 dollars. That if you this is Pravorsky and his I've converted it into more 2019 dollars, but basically their data set, which is through the last century, not the current one, but shows that if a country is already a democracy and has per capita income of that amount or higher, democracy survives indefinitely, and if it falls below that, it becomes more fragile, and the further below that it falls, the more fragile it becomes. Notice that doesn't say anything about inequality, because you can have a very high per capita income in a very unequal country. So it's per capita income. Then a second is the diversification of the economy. This is the whole oil curse literature. We talked about this somewhat in relation to Hirschman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, that if the whole economy is dominated by one sector that's controlled by the government, which is usually the case if it's an oil curse economy, people will be very reluctant to give up power if it's the only access to advancement and success, and they'll be very prone to grab power if they can, if it's the only access to, provides the only access to advancement and success. And so when Al Gore didn't become president in 2000 in the knife-edge election, which many people thought he'd actually won, he wasn't happy. Nonetheless, he could go on corporate boards, go around the world making movies about climate change, and I saw his net worth is $250 million. It's not so bad for him. Not so bad for Al. Wouldn't be the case if he lived in an oil-cursed country. Now, some people would say, it's like people say oil curse is generally speaking bad for democracy. And notice that the countries that have discovered oil after they've been diversified, like Norway or Scotland, don't have this problem. So it's the diversification which creates multiple opportunities for people to advance in the world other than grabbing the commanding heights of the state. It's important, by the way, in the early American Republic that when the capital was, whether it was in New York, Philadelphia, or Washington, these were not places the elites wanted to be. They wanted to be out making money in Virginia on their farms, and so the desire to hold on to power was not particularly strong. It wasn't that valuable to them. And Washington had to be persuaded to run again, so did Jefferson have to be persuaded to run for a second term. That's the kind of thing that highlights the fact that political power wasn't that valuable. Alternation in power. I talked about the two turnover test already. So this is the notion that if you give up power, you're more likely to give up power in the future. Alternation predicts alternation. Coups predict coups, right? So what, India maybe got lucky, whereas Pakistan didn't, and so then you get. There's a big. This is again a paper by Adam Pravorsky saying if you get 1 or 2 turnovers, and certainly if you get 3 turnovers, they go on forever. Now, what's the causal story here is another matter, because it may be the conditions that lead to people being given up, being willing to give up power once, remain. And so it's not the alternation that's predicting the giving up power, but the conditions, like a diversified economy, that's actually making them to keep giving up power into the future. Nonetheless, countries that have histories of alternation tend to alternate, and countries where there's a history of the military jumping into politics when they're not happy, they tend to do it. Another consideration I will just put out there, because it's been a theme in the course so far, and it will be more of a theme in the future, is my intuition. I haven't done systematic research on this, but that that downward mobility and loss aversion are more important than people give credit for. So if you look at some of the countries in which democracy has become fragile, often it's not the poor and it's not people complaining about inequality, but it's downwardly mobile people, middle-class people in Cairo who find the prices going up, for example, and one could give many other examples. So it can be middle-class disaffection when people start to experience or expect that they're going to experience downward mobility. So, but the takeaway is this is largely an interest-based story. It's not so much norms or culture, it seems, but more interest-based. Though, as I said, disentangling some of the causation between the interests and the norms, like the norms of giving up power, can be very tricky to do empirically. Let's, though, talk about transitions. Pravorsky said it's a mug's game trying to predict transitions. Too much contingency in there. And indeed, after 1989, he wrote a piece saying, now we're going to see hundreds of trees get wasted by people coming up with theories of transitions, and at the end of the day, they're not going to be worth a hill of beans because there's too much contingency. Actually, it didn't stop Pravorsky from coming up with his own theory of transitions, but be that as it may, I want to say not so fast. And that while it's true we can't predict transitions, we can learn some interesting things about the conditions that are necessary for them to be successful. And that's what I'm going to be talking about next. So what I want to do first of all is single out some different kinds of transitions from one another. There are basically 4 ways to get from non-democracy to a democracy. One is intervention from outside. A country goes in and installs democracy somewhere else. And the 2 famous success stories here, of course, are West Germany and Japan after World War II. And so the notion that you can't install democracy by force is obviously false, at least as a categorical statement. Now, there are many reasons that people give about why those installations of democracy were successful, ranging from the fact that they both had histories of democracy in the interwar period, to the fact that the Allies stayed there for decades, that they invested in the Marshall Plan in Germany and economic resuscitation of the Japanese economy, to the Cold War and the creation of NATO. But for whatever reason, there have been external installations of democracy. We've seen attempts at that in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, that we'll have more to say about later, where the answer is not so much. Perhaps because all of those conditions were missing, or perhaps for other reasons. We'll be digging into that later. The second way in which you get democracy is by a revolution from below. Democratic revolution. People are opposed to autocracy. They get together, have a revolution, and create a democracy. Some success stories there. Of course, the American Revolution. People tend not to talk about the U.S. when they do comparative politics. The U.S. is one case in the world. And the American Revolution was a successful revolution from below. It was of an elite below, and there was an anti-colonial revolution run by an elite. Nonetheless, it was a revolution from below. The Portuguese Revolution, to a large extent, was a revolution from below. Of all the 1989 transitions, the one that comes closest to a revolution from below was the Romanian transition, where the Ceausescus were just pretty much wheeled out of a court and shot behind a barn. One might say that had the Mensheviks been stronger than the Bolsheviks, Russia might have had a democratic revolution. In 1917, the Mensheviks were Democrats and might have had a very different history, and it turned out, of course, they were not. The Libyan civil war, ongoing civil war, started out with an expectation on the part of NATO and the Western powers that it was going to lead to a democratic transition. Again, not so much. Another subject we're going to revisit. So a third path to democracy is when the elites in power decide to give it up. The military decides to leave power for reasons that, again, people debate. Or even in a non-military regime, an authoritarian regime, the leadership decides to give up power. This happens when Juan Carlos decided to give up power in Spain. It happened in Brazil. Of course, there was pressure from below. It's not these. Another way of putting it, these are sort of ideal types. Many transitions are hybrids to some extent of them, so I wouldn't want to say they all fit in one of these boxes. But the center of gravity is elite willingness to give up power. Would you look at what happened in Egypt in the beginning of the Arab Spring? The military got strongly behind the transition for reasons that are very well described, I think, by in the book Thieves of State by, who wrote Thieves of State? Somebody. Sarah Chase. They very much got behind the initial revolution, but of course they came roaring back into power a year and a half later. So again, not so successful there. And then this is, as I said, political scientists are not famous for elegant terminology. This is Huntington's term, transplacement. And the only reason I use that is Pravorsky's term is even less elegant. He calls it extrication. It's like going to the dentist. So how do you get democracy? By going to the dentist. This is a negotiated settlement, a negotiated transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And this is, South Africa is a classic case. Of the East European ones, the closest to that was the Polish transition, which really starts long before 1989. It starts in the early 1980s when the Solidarity movement emerges in Gdansk, and the regime finds it's necessary to make various concessions to them. And it's almost a decade-long negotiation in Poland, which culminates in 1989, but it's basically a negotiated settlement. Israel-Palestine and Northern Ireland, again, not so much. So again, you can see that the outside and when inside, above, below, and negotiated. That sort of exhausts the universe of possibilities. Now, most of the interest has been in this last category among academics. And I think that the reason for that is probably the reason, partly the reason Pravorsky gives, that if you think about the other three, the extent to which they really depend on contingencies is very high. Predicting when it'll be the case that an invading country will be willing to make the kind of investments that the U.S. made in Japan, Germany and Japan after World War II seems, it seems like a very difficult proposition. Or predicting, if you do have a revolution, whether there'll be divisions among the opposition groups, predicting, that as I said, if the Mensheviks had been stronger, maybe they would have won. There were more democratic forces in the French Revolution that lost out. There were people that wanted to restore some sort of monarchy after the American Revolution. They lost out. But again, this seems like contingencies that you're very unlikely to be able to come up with any generalizations about. Similarly, with elites deciding to transform things from above, it's probably going to depend on unpredictable conflicts among military or political elites, the alternatives that they have available to them, and other things that are going to be, from the point of view of coming up with any kind of serviceable generalizations, accidents of history. So there is literature, but by far the most attention has been focused on these transplacements. And I think one is that people have thought actually they do lend themselves to the tools of social science, even if not predictive tools, in the sense of point predictions, that you can use, among other things, the insights from game theory, and you can predict at least what makes them more likely to succeed or less likely to succeed. And then this is just my observation, I could be wrong, but I think the other reason there's so much attention to negotiated settlements is that it seems normatively good. Democratic paths to democracy seem like a great thing. We don't have to kill thousands of people, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. We can find a way to do it peacefully. And so I think that the fact that this seems to have desirable normative properties makes people want to understand what are the conditions under which you're likely to get a negotiated settlement to democracy. So what are the conditions? And I'm going to give you a sort of stylized picture of these kinds of conflicts. and how they tend to get resolved when they do. And we can think about it as the governing elite, government on the one side, and then the opposition movement, not a political opposition party, because probably the opposition is banned, but there's a government and an opposition, but they're not monolithic. They're not monolithic. They're divided into at least two groups. And so you could think of the stand-patters or reactionaries who are going to fight all change at all times, and then reformers who are at least open to change on the government side. And then on the opposition side, you could think about a division, a mirror image division into moderates and radicals. This is not moderates and reformers about policy, but moderates being people who would, in principle, be open to a negotiated settlement, whereas the radicals think, no, we've got to have a revolution, we've got to take over, and we've got to impose a new dispensation on the country. And what creates the possibility of a negotiated settlement is a circumstance in which reformers and moderates individually are not powerful enough to force change. But if they could get together, they would be, right? If they could get together and form an alliance, they would be. And so then the $64 million question becomes, well, what are the conditions that make that possible or likely? And it's not easy. First thing to say is it's not easy. At least three things have to happen. One is the reformers and moderates have to agree. And if you think of a condition of a decades-long civil war where many people have friends and families who have been killed in this war, very high stakes politics, lots of hatred, lots of resentment and anger, it's not obvious that the reformers and moderates are going to be able to agree, even if there are groups that might be open to change. A second requirement is that the stand-patters and radicals have to be convinced, co-opted, or marginalized. If none of the above, they will throw a wrench into the whole process and stop it, right? Inevitably. Or they'll certainly will try. So unless they can be convinced, co-opted, or marginalized, they're probably going to blow it up before it's done. And then the third is that you have to build support for the new dispensation, because these groups have grassroots supporters, these groups have grassroots supporters, but they're not grassroots supporters for this. There might potentially be, but they're not going to drop out of the sky. If you're going to have a negotiated settlement, people are going to have to build support for it. So those three things have to happen, and they have to happen at the right time. And we'll see what happens when they don't happen at the right time shortly. Okay, so that's a lot, right? It's a big menu. And this means for a negotiated settlement, there's a kind of threading the needle quality to the whole thing. And so when we think about the conditions for successful negotiations, one of them is obviously luck, right? You need luck. And this is what Shavorsky was pointing at when he said you can't generalize about this. And I'm going to use three things you need. You need luck, you need leadership, and you need legitimacy. The reason you need luck is there's so many more ways for them to fail than to succeed. So many things have to line up in the right way at the right time in order to get a successful negotiated settlement. People often talk about the importance of leadership without defining it. I'm going to mean three things by leadership. One is people with an unusual appetite for risk. Most politicians are pretty risk averse. They mostly want to keep what they've got, get reelected, and stay out of trouble. politicians who have the leadership qualities that are going to be required have to have an appetite for risk, but it's not just any old risk. Gambling is risk-taking, but it's reckless. You don't want reckless risk-taking. You want people that have good strategic judgment about what are the risks that must be taken and how must they be taken and to what end. And in particular, you're going to need people who are willing to take big personal risks for a cause that's larger than their own personal interest. And then to have the good strategic judgment to know what is a good calculated risk and what is a reckless move that is not likely to succeed. And the third essential element of good leadership is empathy. Now, empathy is not sympathy, right? Sympathy is feeling sorry for people. Empathy is understanding what people need. It's seeing the world from the point of view of the person you're dealing with. Because if you don't understand what they need, you will not have a successful negotiation with them. So those are the three important elements of effective leadership. Now, when I say legitimacy, I'm alluding here to the debate about democratization from above and from below. And so the story here is that some people say, oh, it's not legitimate if it doesn't come from below. The people have to validate it. Others say, no, it's all about elite pacts, elites making deals with one another. The short answer is that it is both. And the reason is that democracy is a public good in the economist's sense. It's a technical public good. Supplying it to some means supplying it to all, right? It's not excluded, and it's non-rivalrous in that some people having democracy doesn't exclude others from having democracy. So it's a public good, and it's notoriously difficult to supply public goods democratically. And so that means there will be moments when elites have to take decisive action. But if they can't build support for the actions that they are taking, then they're not going to be successful. Yes, sir?
Following the dividing a dollar game and what
yeah.
you mentioned on marginalizing, couldn't you just marginalize elites or marginalize the lower classes and just build a good enough coalition to go forward?
The problem there is who is you. Okay? There's no you to do it. So they have to see it as in their interest. So what I want to do now is work through the South African and Middle East cases here from the perspective of these three considerations. So the luck in South Africa, what was one thing that was very important was a decaying status quo. Whatever the future was going to be, South African elites understood that it wasn't going to be the same as the past. Partly because the new generation of black youth was much more militant than their parents. They were burning down their schools. They were refusing to study in the Afrikaans textbooks, and so on. And so the costs of repression were going up. That meant the children of the white elites didn't want to join the army, as I indicated the first minute of this lecture. And so the elites felt the sand shifting under their feet. That didn't mean you would get democracy, but it meant that the status quo was going to change. The bankruptcy that ensued in the 1980s when Citibank refused to roll over South Africa's debt contributed as well. Another factor, a contingent factor that helped a lot, was the disappearance of communism as a viable alternative, which made whites much less frightened of a transition for reasons I'll talk about on Tuesday. And for the ANC, the Soviet Union stopped funding them in 1983 because the Soviet Union was going bankrupt in Afghanistan and while it was fighting Star Wars spending with the Reagan administration. And so the ANC was in the situation of facing the most powerful army in Africa and didn't have the resources. They went to the Chinese said no, and that produced a group within the ANC that was willing to think about talking about a negotiated settlement. Leadership. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. So I became very consumed with the counterfactual. Here we had the successful negotiated transition in South Africa between Mandela and de Klerk on the one hand. And if you look at Israel-Palestine, it had many structural similarities, but it had failed. So, but for example, in the early 1990s, there had been something called the Oslo Accords. People had, there'd been a lot of negotiating between the PLO and the Israeli government, and many people started to believe that there was going to be a transition to a settlement. And if you went there in 2004 or 2005, most people thought this is coming to a successful conclusion. And indeed, Arafat moved somewhat to the middle. He recognized Israel's right to exist. He took some other of the preconditions off the table that had been so important. And Yitzhak Rabin, they seemed to be converging on a settlement. There was a lot of work had been done to build support for it in both communities. People expected it. Yet when Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli, it all fell apart. Perez came into power. He temporized. He moved to the right. Arafat was phoning him 3 times a week saying, we've got to get this done, because as he had moved to the middle, that's when Hamas emerged on his flank and seized all the symbols of Palestinian nationalism. And so he realized he had to get a deal. Perez tacked to the right, basically cut off the talks. Netanyahu won an election 6 months later anyway, and the sort of window of opportunity closed. So I got interested in, what would have happened if Rabin hadn't been assassinated, and maybe if de Klerk had been assassinated in 1992? How would things have looked differently today, subsequently? And so I went and interviewed de Klerk about this, and I asked him, and I said, what would have happened if you or Mandela had been assassinated during this process? And the backstory here is that as the negotiations had been getting into trouble and breaking down, violence had been increasing in 1991 and early 1992. And this showed up with increasing white anxiety, which expressed itself in the government losing by-elections. They lost 3 big by-elections in a row. And de Klerk responded to this by going on television one night and saying, I'm calling a referendum on whether I should negotiate a settlement with the African National Congress. So that's the backstory here. And so what he said was the following. He said, well, if Mandela had been assassinated in the late 1980s, it might have scuttled things, because at that time he was having secret talks with the government, and it was not clear there was anyone willing to do that in the ANC. And Mandela, had kept them secret because he thought if they failed, people could denounce him as a doddering old man and it wouldn't damage the ANC's cause. That's what I mean, the willingness to take risks for a cause that's larger than yourself. De Klerk said, in my case, if I had been assassinated after the referendum, which he won by a 2/3 majority, he said it wouldn't really have mattered because whoever replaced me would have gone on. But the reason I went on television and announced the referendum was that everyone in my cabinet would have opposed it, and everyone in the National Party would have opposed it. And so I just went in and announced it as a fait accompli. And if you think of a circumstance in which I had been shot before I had called the referendum, there wouldn't have been anyone in a position to do it. And even if they had wanted to do it, it's not something a new president can do is they have to build support in the cabinet and so on. So then it might well have played out. It might well have played out differently. That was very important because the fact that he won that referendum and essentially took on the far right in his own party meant that the ANC could convince the skeptics there that he was serious, that he was essentially burning bridges with the far right of the National Party establishment and making his future depend upon getting a successful negotiation with the ANC. And so that was a level of risk-taking, sometimes what solved what political scientists called the commitment problem. Skeptics in the ANC could be persuaded by Ramaphosa and Mandela, who were for negotiations, that this was a person with whom they could work. So that was one of the ways in which he took on the opposition. The other thing to say is that it's very important to build support from below. If you look at, fast forward to 2000, when Bill Clinton is about to leave office, he decides, like many American presidents before him, that the last thing he's going to do is solve the Middle East conflict on the way out in the summer of 2000. And he brings Arafat and the Israeli leader, who by that point was Barak. He drags them to Washington and says, you need to make this deal that wasn't made 5 years ago when Rabin was killed. And they both say no. And he thinks, Bill Clinton thought if he just can get people in a room and twist their arms and look them in the eye and tell them that they're the most important people in the world, he can get it done. And the reason he couldn't get it done was that there was no support in either community in the summer of 2000. The Palestinian support was below 10%, and Israeli support was below 8%. So even though it was substantially the same deal as 5 years before, it didn't matter. There was no support for it. There were no constituencies for it. And this is why below matters as well as above. And so, The Economist was writing about these articles. What's wrong with the Palestinians? They never miss an opportunity, and so on and so forth. They didn't understand that the dynamics on the ground were different. And so you have to have the support from below. Right. So we can't predict transitions, but we can say something about what makes them more and less likely. For one thing, we can predict failure. In 1983, Jerry Adams became head of Sinn Féin, the IRA, and people said, oh, this is a new kind of politician. He wears business suits. He talks like a Western politician. Maybe there can be a settlement in Northern Ireland. But of course, in 1983, you had a conservative government in Westminster that was crucially dependent on the Northern Irish for its parliamentary majority. So there was no question, far from the status quo being a wasting asset, the sand shifting under their feet, there was no possibility that the Tories would make a deal with the IRA. 1997, when Tony Blair comes in, Labour's not dependent on the Northern Irish vote, so then it becomes a possibility. And eventually we get the Good Friday Accords, which semi-unravel later. So you could think usefully about the conditions here. What is it that's going to move the elites, and will they think that they can't move? Empathy and strategic judgment, hugely important. One thing de Klerk said to me that I thought was very interesting in that interview, at the end of it I said to him, what do you think explains the difference between the South Africa and the Israel-Palestine negotiations? And he said, well, one important difference was that when we decided to legalize the ANC and the opposition movements, we had no preconditions. And when the ANC 3 months later decided to suspend the armed struggle, there were no preconditions. we didn't ask them to recognize our legitimacy. We wanted them to decommission, but we didn't make a requirement. No preconditions. Of course, there are implicit preconditions in the sense that if you don't deliver within before the window of opportunity closes, it'll all fall apart. But he said the fact that there were no explicit preconditions meant that we had more room to maneuver. And of course, it meant the spoilers couldn't violate the preconditions. If you say these talks will go on and as long as there are no rockets, there will be rockets, right? That's empathy. It's understanding. It's understanding what people need. Mandela understood that even though the ANC was opposed to power sharing in the permanent constitution, de Klerk had to get it in the interim constitution, or there wouldn't have been a transition. So he agreed to it, and later on it went away. In April 1993, a black radical leader, Chris Hani, was murdered, and the violence erupted, and it threatened to engulf the whole process. And one of the ways in which it was tamped down was that de Klerk agreed that the election would occur no later than a year after Hani's death. So it had to be by April 1994, so a definite date that it had to occur. And that enabled Mandela and the ANC to quell the violence and move things forward. So that's hugely important, that you understand what the other side needs and make sure they can get what they need, otherwise it's going to fall apart. Exit options, right? People have to find it possible to give up power. In South Africa, they promised an amnesty process. They promised civil service jobs, security for 5 years. This harkens back to our earlier discussion of the Soviet Union, that the exit costs were lower because of the way privatization occurred. And when we think about the demonstration effects here of the ways in which Gaddafi and Mubarak met their fates, it doesn't augur well, because the leaders in other countries that might be facing opposition movements think about what will happen to them if they leave. So good things don't always go together. Let's give de Klerk the last word before we head out.
I think it was an absolute necessity that he had to be released. As his image grew over the years, as he became an icon, as he became a crucial flashpoint in the whole international situation also of South Africa, it became clear to me that, that he has a pivotal role to play, and that he was playing it irrespective of the fact that he was in jail. He was leaner than I thought. He was taller than I thought. And my very first impression was that he was a very dignified man. We were both reserved, but there was immediately a sort of a good spark between us. He had a few habits. Firstly, he was a very good listener. He would rarely or almost never interrupt one when one was making a point. On the other hand, he got highly irritated if he was interrupted. I was scoring points in the debate. He leveled the score by fairly near to the end, but before we reached the end, suddenly reaching out and taking my hand.
I am proud to hold your hand for us to go forward together.
It was a masterpiece, that taking my hand. He's good at it. I took his hand, nothing I could do about it, and lifted quietly in my mind my hat to him and said, "Well done."
Okay, we'll see you on Tuesday.